welcome to Telling True Tales, going beyond the subtitles for Comic-Con at Home 2021. Today we're going to be speaking with authors and illustrators, sometimes both in the same person, of nonfiction works. And I'm going to introduce our participants and then have some Q&A with them. So today I am pleased to be hosting Kristen Radtke. Kristen is the author of the graphic nonfiction book, Imagine Wanting Only This, the recipient of a 2019 Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant. She is the art director and deputy publisher of The Believer. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Marie Claire, The Atlantic, The Guardian, GQ, Vogue, and Oxford American, among many other publications. Kristen's new work is Seek You, A Journey Through American Loneliness. I'm also pleased to introduce Alverne and Stacey Robinson. Alverne has an MFA in fiction writing from Columbia College Chicago. He's the recipient of the 2014 and 2015 Glyph Rising Star Award for his writing on One Nation, Old Druids. In 2009, he received the first ever Luma Arts Graphic Novel Writing Award. He lives in Illinois. And Stacey is an assistant professor of graphic design at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. As part of the collaborative team Black Kirby with artist John Jennings, he creates graphic novels, gallery exhibitions, lectures, and workshops that use strategies to imagine new worlds inspired by design, hip hop, the arts and sciences, and diasporic African belief systems. Their new work is Across the Tracks, Remembering Greenwood, Black Wall Street, and the Tulsa Race Massacre. And Dr. Rebecca Hall and Hugo Martínez. Dr. Hall, JD, PhD, is a scholar, activist, and educator. Dr. Hall's work has been supported by numerous grants and fellowships, including the American Association of University Women, the Ford Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. Hugo Martínez is an independent comic artist focused on depicting narratives of struggle, identity, and resilience. Their new work is Wake, the Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts. And Erika Moen and Matthew Nolan. Erika and Matthew are both full-time professional cartoonists and comic book creators. They've been married for 12 years and working together for the past 8. They reside in Portland, Oregon. Together they run a sex education-focused webcomic called Oh Joy Sex Toy, which has won an assortment of accolades over the years and was even featured in the Tate Museum in London, England. Let's Talk About It, The Teen's Guide to Sex, Relationships, and Being a Human is their first young adult published work. So my first question to y'all is, what makes the topic meaningful to you? And Erika and Matt, I'm going to start with you because I like segueing into let's talk about it.
Sure.
Yeah, well, thank you for that lovely intro. Yeah, do you want to take a bash?
Because sex is such a fundamental part of being a human, and whether or not you're having sex or not, it is a part of our culture. It's a part of how we reproduce. It's a part of how we relate to each other and build relationships and wreck relationships. It's just baked into everything in our society, basically. So yeah, and yet we don't teach teenagers how to think and talk about it. We either just say like, don't do it, or we say condom goes on a penis, good luck. And our book is like, hey, you may find yourself in situations where you're not sure how to proceed, and like feelings are involved, and you like, how do you ask somebody out, and how do you get to the point where you're like, should I get out a condom? So the book is more about how to think and talk about the relationship and interpersonal aspects that come with becoming an adult who gets into relationships of varying intimacies.
So much of the book was, is an answer to us when we were kids,
Yeah.
and having those experiences and having all these questions, and having to roll condoms on bananas but still not really feeling adequately.
It's like, how does that even relate to real life?
Yeah. So much of it was writing a book for our younger selves. Yeah.
Fantastic. And that's going to lead me to ask Kristen to talk a little bit about CQ and about relationships and about how being alone is not necessarily equivalent to being lonely. And in your case, I know, even though this feels very relevant right now because we're emerging from a post-pandemic world in which loneliness has certainly played a part, you started this a while ago.
Yeah, I started writing this book in 2016, or I should say I didn't start writing the book. I started writing about and drawing loneliness in 2016. And I did this series, I did this illustrated series where I was drawing people who were physically alone in public in urban settings. And I kind of thought that would be as far as it would go. I thought that was the project. I was sort of just like interested in that as like from a composition standpoint. And then I started thinking about loneliness more critically for the first time, and doing research about loneliness and figuring out like what actually is loneliness, and why do some people feel lonely more than other people feel lonely, and stuff like that. Like, what does loneliness actually do to us? Like, why are we biologically programmed to feel lonely at all? And I just became really fascinated by it and really interested in the ways that we connect with one another or fail to connect with one another. And certainly during the pandemic, it was, for a lot of people, it was maybe the most lonely time of their lives, or maybe their first experience with prolonged isolation. But I think that the loneliness of the pandemic is very different from sort of the cultural problem of loneliness. Like, I think that there's no question that the pandemic and the isolation that resulted caused us to reevaluate our relationship to one another, like how much we really have to depend on one another. How, I remember I live in New York, and there was at the very beginning, like the trucks weren't coming in with food and everyone was panicked that we weren't going to get food. I mean, that's a great example of just how interconnected we are. Even though you feel very self-sufficient when you go to the grocery store and get your food, you think you don't need to rely on other people for that, but of course you
hunted down that wild.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I think that the pandemic, it was a period of serious loneliness. It was sort of an imposed loneliness on everyone, an imposed isolation on everyone. So that's really different from topics like chronic loneliness, which I was examining in the book.
Absolutely. And you took on some pretty difficult subject matters in your various sections. When I was reading the books for this panel, almost all of them, including yours, I read in chunks because I would hit something, I would just sort of have to sit with it for a while. So, for example, at one point, I read the section talking about, America's love affair with guns. Mm-hmm. I used to be a constituent of Gabby Giffords, and for that and a variety of other reasons, that part really hit me, and I kind of sat with it for a while. But also the last section, when you're talking about the experiments with the importance of touch and the experiments with separating, the monkeys, and what was it like preparing for that?
I think first of all, like, I think when I set out to write the book, I didn't think that I would examine all the things I examined. You read one book and it brings you to another book and it brings you to another book, and you ask a new question, and then that takes you down this different rabbit hole. And I think that's what's so exciting about the form that I was working in, like a sort of essayistic form, is that you can just sort of like let your mind wander in that way, and you can just kind of follow your whims a little bit, and suddenly you realize they're all really connected. So I don't know. I think actually that the book wasn't difficult to write. Like, it wasn't difficult to write. I mean, it was hard to write. Every book is hard to write, and hard to draw, but it wasn't emotionally difficult for me, just because I think that actually examining loneliness sort of intellectually caused me to feel less lonely. Like, I think I felt less lonely by the end of the book than I did before. I felt less separate from one another. Like, by sort of examining our separation as a country, I felt more connected to the country, and sort of like I felt like I understood the root of its problems, even though I don't necessarily have a solution for how we solve them.
Right.
But certainly there's a fair amount of dark material. I mean, Harry Harlow, the scientist who did those studies on monkeys, is a great example of someone who was just completely driven mad by isolation, and his inability to connect with other people.
And I actually felt that your sort of conclusion with him was very generous, where you sort of said, obviously he had his own personal issues with loneliness in relationships, and he perpetuated some really horrific things, but the outcome of it was the understanding that parents and children should be touching, and moving away from that previous bad decision. So so I thought that was really generous. So part of Kristen's point in talking about loneliness is talking about some of the ways that the country was divided even before the pandemic, including things like talking about important subjects like race relations. Dr. Hall, do you and Hugo want to take this? And then we'll go to Alverne and Stacey.
So Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts, that I wrote and that Hugo illustrated, came out just this beginning of June. And I basically turned my dissertation into a graphic novel. It tells the story of women who participated and led slave revolts, both in colonial New York and on slave ships. And it tells the story of my attempts to recover that history. And it tells the story of living in the wake of slavery and its afterlife. Yeah, did you want to add anything, Hugo? Or?
Sure. I was just going to say that, my reason to be interested in this subject is that, for a long time I've been doing illustrations, and I worked as a graphic designer for a long time with this hope that, somehow I could work creating work that would talk about justice and injustice, and I got the opportunity to work with Dr. Hall, and that seemed like a great opportunity to really use my ability to tell stories that otherwise would go literally buried. And this is a chance to really talk about resistance, moments of resistance that up till now have gone uncovered.
And Alverne and Stacey, obviously Greenwood has been a topic of recent conversation nationally, but I feel like you had a particular focus as well on what part of that story you wanted to tell. Do you want to address that?
My focus was on telling the true story of the people that made Greenwood what it was. A lot about what we talk about when we think of Greenwood or Tulsa, everyone wants to talk about the race massacre and the deaths and the atrocity. And I wanted to talk about the before. I wanted to talk about the paradise or the Eden before, the fall of it. So for me, it was more about the importance of telling this story and the people that lived there and that built up Black Wall Street and Greenwood, and less about the atrocity that had occurred.
And, one of the things that I love to think about in reference to the book is and Alverne has spoken on this many times, that you won't see one bloody, body in the book, one burned body in the book. Like, we really focused on celebrating the life of the citizens of Greenwood and Black Wall Street. And I think that is a very unique kind of perspective. And it is the first graphic novel on the subject matter. So there's so much to think about it and talk about in reference to the book. The color choices, for example, this is a primer for educators, librarians, for parents who want to talk about this subject matter.
So, Stacey, you mentioned in part the idea that this could be beginning primer for librarians, et cetera, et cetera. So my question to all of you, and I'll start with the two of you, is, you know, the idea of a primer or something nonfiction sometimes can cause some hesitancy, right? Like, oh, you know, that's my peas. I just want to eat my dessert. So how do you hand sell your book if you're a bookseller or a librarian? What is it that you say to the person that you're convincing to read it?
I would say, I guess I would pitch it as like, do you want to learn about a little piece of unknown American history? Because that's literally what it is. It's a part of American history. It is quite essentially the story, the great American story of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. So that's kind of how I would pitch it. If I was a bookseller, saying, hey, if you ever wanted to know about this forgotten piece of American history, and then you can start in with that. And then, you know, there's so much background on just this segment in history of Tulsa that, you know, and then when you talk about the essay, if you talk about the essay and how that links to the Trail of Tears, then it's like, oh, we're expanding on that American history, you know. So I think that's how I would pitch it, is like, hey, you know, this forgotten or unknown part of American history. And then, you know, you blow their minds away by all the great achievements that are in the book, I think.
Yeah, so I'm a visual artist, a graphic designer, illustrator.
Are you really?
My elevator pitch is actually with the artwork, right? So I would actually, I pull out a copy of the book. I pull out the iPad that I made the pages on, and I show them the process, right? So when I'm presenting on, I presented on this book a lot. Alverne and I think we do an average of maybe 2 panels a week, you know, since like, I think like a couple of months before the book came out, actually. Yeah. And, you know, one of my favorite things to do is actually just to show the process, because as an educator, and I always like to call myself a propaganda artist, I am recruiting. You know, I'm always recruiting young artists to tell their stories, because we need more diverse stories. I jokingly said, I wish I had a book that taught me how to approach a woman, and this is, you know, and ask her out on a date, you know, or to talk about the you know, I need that book, you know, that as a teenager, right? And I need that book right now. So I did order your book, thank you. And I'm gonna read it. I'm like, this is what I've been doing wrong for 30 years. But you know, that is how I sell it. Like I said, I pull out the iPad, I show the process, and I encourage people to try it. Like, that's how you know, I'm selling more than a book. I'm actually really trying to sell opportunities for other people to tell their stories. Sorry for that long answer.
Oh, that's
okay.
Great.
So that seems like a real natural flow into, let's talk about it. So other than, you know, helping past Stacey, how do you sell this book? How do you put it in people's hands?
Yeah, the elevator pitch is, if you've got somebody in your life who's interested, or if you know people who are interested in sex, which is everybody, you're not even wanting to have sex or anything like that, but anybody who's just naturally interested in the topic and has kind of learned a little bit about the basics. They know how sex happens, but they still have questions. That's who the book's for. It takes those questions, tries to answer them, tries to help young people, and really push the direction of, you know, talking and communication and all those good things. It feels like the perfect supplement to the very bare bones basic education that you might get.
I actually got inspired by Alverne's answer when you said, do you want to know about American history? Or how did you say that?
Yeah, I think that's what I said. If you want to know about a piece of forgotten American history or something to that degree.
Well, I was thinking like, hey, do you need some help being a human? Check out our book. Like, that's the elevator pitch.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, and I know, Matt mentioned young people, but I also like the fact that the dedication is, for anybody of any age who is seeking more information on how to relate to other humans. So given the topic and the fact that people may be hesitant to take it on right now, thinking this is not a time I want to look at what loneliness is, and even if it maybe encourages us to put a name to it and address it, how would you hand sell this?
I think that it's a hope. I mean, to me, it's a hopeful book. I think that it's not a, there's certainly a way to look at things like loneliness and our sort of inability to connect with one another in a sort of a nihilistic way. But I'm not a nihilist. I didn't feel like a nihilist making the book. I don't feel like it makes nihilistic arguments. It's for me, it's about, by looking at our failure to connect, we can maybe learn to connect with one another. So I do feel like the argument that the book is making is for interdependence, and it's for a sort of dismissing of things, individualism is so ingrained in American ideology. And so I'm trying to also, I think, uncover, just to sort of demystify the total myth of sort of like the American outsider as an identity. It's kind of like the grocery store example that I said earlier of, like, you go to the grocery store, you get your food, you think that's it. And it's not. You're part of the same, I'm a gardener, and you're taught sort of to think about your garden as like a stop on sort of like a path for pollinators, like the bees and the birds and everything are going there. Like you're not actually just creating one little ecosystem, you're creating like another stop in an ecosystem for pollinators to need to get where it's going. And I think the problem in America and in a lot of wealthier countries is that we think of our individual gardens as being completely detached from the gardens around them, which is, of course, really flawed and actually very, very dangerous.
Right. You may be doing everything right, but if you're not connected to the ecosystem, your neighbors can be using Monsanto.
Exactly.
So, going back on unknown American history, I think that takes us back to Wake. For example, Dr. Hall, I think one of the preconceptions that people have is that somehow race relations are a Southern thing. And for example, the part where you're talking about looking into, records in New York City, which, maybe people don't think of as being a place that made a lot of its initial money on slavery.
Right. Yeah. Part of the book does take place in colonial New York in the early 1700s, and part of the goal is to be kind of a corrective in this idea that slavery was just a Southern phenomenon, or even just a rural phenomenon. Slavery was also very much an urban thing, and northern. Slavery didn't end in New York, the state of New York, until 1827, and people were visitors were allowed to keep enslaved people with them, until like 1841. And New York City is a very important city in this country. It's financial capital of the country, and unfortunately, the institution of slavery was a big part, as you were saying, a big part in the creation of the city of New York and the building of it. Yeah.
Hugo, anything to add? Are you selling people on Wake by your iPad like Stacey, or?
I think a lot of it happens with just saying the title. I think, like Dr. Hall has said that in the past, where it's just like, this title is captivating to people because there is this impression that, women did not participate in slave revolts, and there's this history that just goes totally neglected because, the impression is that history is this just long trudge into the established order, when there are all these moments in history that are actually resisting all of these possible outcomes, including white supremacy and patriarchy. And I think Wake does an excellent job of getting these points across that, this is, that where we are right now, the moments of resistance that we're experiencing right now, there is a history of that. And Dr. Hall, I know you have so much more to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, if I were going to do an elevator pitch for the book Wake, I would explain that it tells this, that I'm the granddaughter of slaves, not the great granddaughter, whatever. My paternal grandparents were born in slavery in the year 1860, and slavery didn't end in this country until 1865. And it's a corrective for how poorly this history is taught, and particularly the history of resistance to slavery. And it also engages in the conversation of what it's like to live in the wake of slavery and being in the afterlife of slavery, which is something that all of us in America share. Yeah.
And your use of wake in the sense of, the wake left by a boat or that sort of thing.
Right. It's exactly. It's like wake of a slave ship, wake, living in the wake of slavery, and also wake as in a way to honor the dead. So the term wake has kind of multiple valences in the book. Yeah,
absolutely. So, and that sort of leads me into a more art-focused question for the moment, which is talking about challenges or favorite elements of the artistic part of the storytelling. And Hugo, do you want to sort of talk about what you were inspired to use in Wake?
So, reading the script and reading Dr. Hall's writing, I just really delved into a lot of water themes and a lot of what's in reflective surfaces as these, these little literal mirrors to our world, where we see, just the reflections of the history that are in New York City, that are in and any reflective surface, there's this specter of the past. So that was an important element that was really, in a way, just exciting to kind of explore as a visual element. And then there was the element of water, which, I learned so much about how water moves and how I did so many iterations of water, and it was something really, I don't know. I was so excited every moment that I had to depict water, because it's such a literally moving force and element, and a great metaphor for resistance. There's a bit of a part of that was also integrated into the medium itself, where I used I decided that I would use actual ink, because of its potential to be expressive and to have these liquid elements that would further depict this concept of water as a river of resistance that Dr. Hall eloquently talks about.
That's amazing. Stacey, do you want to talk a little bit about whether your color choices or other elements depicted the tale that you were trying to tell, which was about the vibrance and vitality of the community that was lost?
Absolutely. So just like you said, those choices were made deliberately. Like I said, as a graphic designer, as an illustrator, I thought about how this book would be perceived. I thought about how we tend to like to think about history. We tend to like to think about Black history specifically. and then the original photos and documentation themselves, right? So in contrast to that, I wanted to tell this story not in black and white and not in sepia tone, but in very full, vibrant color. And that was a choice. So one of the things that it does as an approach is it kind of ages the book down from young adult to maybe even like elementary, for example, right? And with that, I wanted the reader to see the vibrancy, the opulence of the Black community that was destroyed, right? And it, with that in a particular way, yes, it looks more like a comic, but at the same time, it makes it more realistic, in my opinion. And another storytelling choice that I chose was to where there are so many, I'll talk about a few of them. One of them is you will not see one muzzle flare, meaning that you don't see the fire of the gun. You see the sound effects, the boom and the pow, for example, but you don't see the muzzle flares. And in that particular sense, it was a way to, yes, make it more realistic, but also really I thought about those who would be offended and say it would be too, I tried to take away almost every barrier that I could to hinder someone from picking up the book and reading about this history. And then one of my favorite storytelling approaches is that this is a book about Black people fighting back. So you will see Black people with guns fighting back, defending their homes, right? But every time you see that, I put the reader on the side of Black people. And for example, there is a scene where the citizens are marching across the tracks toward the courthouse, and the reader is in the crowd with them. There's a particular scene where there are Black people defending their home, and we are in the home of the people. As the reader, we are in the home on that side of the story. So regardless of where you fall on the commentary for this particular moment as you're reading the book, you are on the side of Black people, and you understand how you understand how we look at history collectively as Black people. I'm saying collectively, like I'm not speaking for all Black people. But you also see my interpretation, my choice of telling this story, of telling Alverne's story, right? So I put you on the side of my particular commentary, experiencing that moment as I spent the entire last 12 months in the house working on not only this book, but various other graphic design projects and exhibitions and things of that nature, responding to the summer of 2020. So a lot of that ends up in the book, and I try my best to make you feel what I was feeling at the time of making the book.
So you mentioned earlier the fact that you did a non-traditional structure. This isn't a comic book told in panels. You did a different setup. So was that your favorite element when you were creating this, or what was an element in the graphic part that you really enjoyed?
I approach this book differently than I approach most other projects. I mean, I tend to work in more traditional panel structures. That's also, I think, easier to do in a narrative, or I shouldn't say easier to do, it just makes more sense in a narrative. If I literally have to get a character from one room to another or from one space to another, I use sequential arts to do that. This book, I felt like I wanted to try something different. And it wasn't even a conscious choice so much as this is just what came out in sort of the early drafts. So it is sort of more organic shapes. The images sort of bleed into each other, and the images make their own arguments too, but they're not necessarily always, they don't interact with the text in the same way that they might with, like a dialogue bubble, even though I do, have dialogue bubbles, but it's not like a traditional sequential comic in that way. So that was really fun. I mean, that of course posed different problems, and it's like, how do you avoid drawing the same thing over and over? Book about loneliness. How do I avoid keep drawing someone alone in a dark room? I sort of did have that impulse, but I think over time just like in any project, at least for me, whenever I draft a comic, the whole sort of fill in, if I have a 6-panel grid, the whole sort of fill in, they don't fill in always in order. I can figure out kind of maybe what goes in panel 6 before I figure out what goes in panel 2. And this book was similar. I might have figured out what was going to go on the top of page 47 before I figured out what was going to go on the top of page 2. And so that was a fun experiment. And it was also the first book I've done in color, the first extended project I've ever done in color. And that was a huge challenge. I don't feel like before this, I didn't feel very comfortable with color. I didn't have a lot of practice with color. I'd never studied things like color theory. And so figuring out, again, like the language of image, then the language of color, and how color communicates a mood or an argument or a point of view, and how, you put one color here and how does it interact with this color over here, and it completely changes the meaning of this color over here. So that was really hard, but it was probably one of the more rewarding parts of the project.
Amazing. And you also occasionally made the choice to reproduce documents, which I think is unusual. So was that, how did that feel, so that you weren't just tracing them?
Yeah, I love reproducing documents. Actually, that's really my, I do that without really thinking about it. Like I think for my first book, someone mentioned that of like, you're sort of showing the process of research, you're sort of showing the back end kind of how something is discovered. And I never really thought about it like that, because for me, it's just like, that's just what nonfiction is sometimes you kind of show the source. But I think that actually is a really fun part of drawing nonfiction comics, is sort of getting to interact with different kinds of documents and different kinds of information. I like drawing historical photographs, and I try to draw them in a different style than I would draw, the other art in the book. And I like drawing, like old papers and old book, pages from old books and stuff like that. And then thinking about how that image can interact with maybe a more traditional image of like human figures or something like that.
Don't have a graceful segue for this one, but I do want to talk a little bit about artistic choices in Let's Talk About It, and talk about when you chose to do things like importantly, accurate depictions of body parts, and when you chose to do your own little kind of cute icons that are a little more than eggplants and peaches, but not necessarily
but not by much.
Yeah, we call those
marshmallow people
or marshmallow things. But there's a time and a place for them. They're very soft and
the marshmallow people.
Marshmallow people. Very nondescript, and they kind of get an idea across, but they don't get the details across. And we'll use that to like help deconstruct a really tough idea or something that's designed to supplement the writing rather than be the focus of the attention.
And I actively use marshmallow people when we're talking about stuff that can apply to any type of body. It doesn't matter what kind of genitals you have or how you are shaped. So a marshmallow person is just like, this is a floofy person, and anybody with a body, this applies to anybody with a body. Look at the floofy person do it. And then when I would go in and draw like actual explicit, these are the genitals and this is this bit.
Sometimes we've got to talk about, brass tacks. We've got to talk about it, right?
And you need to know, like, no, this is specifically what we're talking about. If you have something that looks like this information applies to you. If you don't have something that looks like this information still applies to you, because you should know how other people's stuff works. So yeah, it's about when we need to target the information, like this is specifics, this is details, and when it's more of a general concept.
Yeah.
I like that the marshmallow people were inclusive, but I also liked that the people who are having sort of the framing conversations are also a variety of genders, ages, body shapes, abilities, races.
Yeah, what's something interesting is we've got it's being translated into other languages now, and we're getting notes back being like, because in English our language is gender neutral-ish.
We can be really flexible with things.
Yeah, I mean, like lamp and glass, like those aren't gendered words. It's a gender neutral language that way, but like Italian is not gender neutral, and so we're getting notes back being like, so this character who looks like this but has this junk, which pronoun are we using for the gendered language going forward? And it's like, oh.
And it becomes tough because we really tried our best not to gender some characters, right? Like we really wanted to kind of keep it nice and open. The aim of the game is really for people to be able to read it and put themselves into whoever they're reading. So we go through a huge diverse cast of teens who are asking other teens questions and, you know, getting answers back. And we really tried to mix it up as best as we could.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for taking time to be with us today. A quick reminder to the people viewing via Comic-Con at Home that all of the participants' books are available from the link in the on below, which is to Mysterious Galaxy, longtime bookseller at San Diego Comic-Con, or at wherever books are sold. And once again, thank you for joining us.